Are we good? Awesome. I did something very dumb yesterday. I did do a park run. I did a park run yesterday because I looked at my schedule for the next 2 months, and the next time I'll be able to do a park run is on the 23rd of September. So I decided it's my last Saturday to do a park run, but I also had signed up myself for the Spa Lady 10K in the afternoon. Yeah, dumb. That's all I'm saying. And as my husband says, self-inflicted. Self-inflicted. We used to say that to my dad all the time when he goes to a run and comes back and complain. Self-inflicted. You chose to ran. You chose to run. I said it about myself. Self-inflicted. And so I told my dad at the park run I'm doing this, and he looked at me and he goes, "You're dumb." And I'm like, "Excuse me, sir. You went for a 15K run before you came to the park run. Just because you do it before the park run and I do it after the park run, we're both dumb." That's all that I'm saying. So I'm feeling a little bit like a legend this morning. I did lose 2 toenails. It's okay. Hopefully they'll grow back. Self-inflicted, people. Self-inflicted. This morning I want to, you can see my toes later. No, don't worry, here I want to see my toes. It's where I'm wearing closed shoes today. Not just because of the weather, because you do not want to see these toes right now. But I want to speak to you this morning about a message that I believe will probably become one of my life messages. A couple of months ago, I was able to go to the UK, and in hindsight, looking at the trip, I just saw this thread that God was trying to tell me the whole way through the trip. And it's the title for today's message, that is, "You Belong in the Room." And I shared with you a couple of weeks ago, I got to the airport, Mark and the kids dropped me off. I got into the queue and I got a phone call from Mark to say, "You won't believe it, but Dr. Paul and Dr. Carol Alexander, who had just been to preach at Liberty Church, are on the same flight." And I was like, "That's great." They got upgraded. I didn't get upgraded. And they're inviting you to join them in the business lounge. And I'm like, me in the business lounge, not going to happen. So I'm like, polite, that's nice. I'll see if I see them in the queue. Anyway, I did see them in the queue, because if you've ever been to OR Tambo and you've been to passport control, it's like it weaves the whole way. And so I happened to bump into them in the weaving queue. And every time we crossed each other, they said to me, "See you in the lounge. Come to the lounge. Come join us in the lounge." And I was like, polite. And honestly, inside I was like, I'm not going to the lounge. I don't belong in the lounge. And so anyway, they get through passport control and they go off and they come back and they wave at me, who I'm still in the queue. "Come join us in the lounge." And I'm like, I don't belong in the lounge. But sure, thumbs up, I'll come to the lounge. Get through passport control, try and find the lounge. And now I'm trying to think, okay, how do I own this? How do I walk like I'm meant to be there, right? And I'm like, the worst thing for me, I don't know about you, but I hate to cause a queue. You ever felt like that? Like, I don't want to be the reason why all of a sudden there's now 10 people behind me, and I don't want to have to explain. I don't know how much it's going to cost. I don't know. And so I'm walking to the gentleman at the counter. There's no queue, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to start one. And before I can say anything, explain away, he says to me, "Mrs. Reeves, welcome in." I was like, what? So I walked in like I owned it. I was like, I'm going there. I connected to the Wi-Fi, because you know you've got refrigerator rights when your phone connects to the Wi-Fi. So I connect to the Wi-Fi. I was helping myself to food. I was helping myself to coffee. I was helping myself to cool drinks, not the other drinks. I was living it. I belonged in the room. And Paul and Carol gave me access to the room. And because I had been given access to the room, I had access to everything that was in the room. And Jesus was reminding me, I gave you access to the room. And therefore, you have access to everything that is in the room. You belong in the room. And then a couple of days later, I have to laugh at this. You know, I'm a girl from Benoni, like far east. And then I progressed and I moved to the Vale, you know, Eden Vale. There's like a little bit east. But here is this girl from Benoni / the Vale, sitting in a pastor's tea with one of the most, I think, influential speakers in the world at the moment is Lisa Bevere. Now, John and Lisa Bevere have been in ministry for years, and I've been to many conferences with Lisa Bevere. But Pastor Karen, Pastor Stacy, and myself, we somehow found ourselves in this pastor's tea, and there was only 24 of us. And there were only 4 tables, and there was no nameplates, and so we just sat down at a table. The next thing, Lisa Bevere sits down next to us at the table. I'm like, what? On the inside, right? I'm sitting next to Lisa Bevere. And I didn't say anything. I was like, all right, calm. I've got this. I'm sitting next to Lisa Bevere. And I'm like, how do I start a conversation? And she turns to me and she goes, I love your accent. And I'm like, oh, I love you. I mean, your accent too. And I just thought, how is this possible that a girl from Benoni who's not adding anything to the room but is in the room and sitting next to Lisa Bevere? And God's going, you belong in the room. Even if you're not doing anything, God has made access for us. There's Lisa and Sophia, besties right now. That chair on the left there, that's where I was sitting. There is a picture of me and Lisa together, but it's terrible. I'm like, I can't inflict that on anybody. Of me, not of Lisa. She looks fab. She said something that really stood out to me. She's 63, by the way. She is a legend. And she said the only reason why John and I are still talking is not because of that we have a particular gifting. She says it's just that we've outlasted everybody else, that we've kept our first love. And so our message might not be profound, it might not be, but we've kept it our first love, and we've just simply outlasted everybody else. Never negate your first love. And so I want to share with you just about rooms this morning, and I want to unpack 3 rooms today. And the first one, I'll go through them quickly, but the first one is the rooms that we exclude ourselves from. The second one is the room that we should have the courage to stay in. And the third one is the room that we should have the courage to step into. And so the first room I want to talk about this morning is Genesis 18, and it's where we introduced to Abraham and Sarah. And Abraham and Sarah have received a promise from God 24 years prior to this passage that Abraham will be the father of nations, and Sarah, nations will come from you. A 24-year promise. Anybody waited for anything for 24 years? They waited for this promise for 24 years. 24 years later, Abraham and Sarah, they were fathering nothing, never mind a nation. The promise hadn't come through yet. And then we read in Genesis 18, verse 1, and I'm going to skip it just for the sake of time, but what happens is the Lord appears to Abraham, and these 3 strangers come and visit Abraham. And the reason he knew that they were probably angels or an angelic visitation was because they were traveling in the heat of day. No one traveled in the heat of day. And so Abraham sees them, runs to them, bows down and says, can I give you some food? I think he would have fitted into Liberty because food, Can I give you some food? And so these visitors say, absolutely, no problem. Come, we can have some food. And we jump into where it says in Genesis 18, verse 9 to 15. I haven't had coffee yet, so just give me, it's coming. I know it's coming. They said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she is in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of woman had ceased to be with Sarah. I love how the Bible puts that, but anyway. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? And the Lord said to Abraham, why does Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. In verse 9, it says there, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and you will have a son. A 24-year-old promise is renewed and reconfirmed. They reconfirm a promise. And 1 year later, they have Isaac. 25-year promise. I would love to be able to say to you that Abraham and Sarah held on to that promise securely for 25 years. But looking back, they didn't. They had doubt. They tried to make it happen in their own strength. Abraham tried to make it happen with Hagar. The promise wasn't just for Abraham, it was Abraham and Sarah. So they may not have held on to the promise of God, but the promise of God held on to them. And so you may have a promise that has been spoken over your life. Maybe you haven't held on to it so securely. But can I encourage you this morning that the promise that God gave you is holding on to you? There are promises that are in this room. The promise of God held on to them. In verse 10, it says, Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Sarah wasn't in the room. Sarah had excluded herself from the room. I don't know about you, but if an angel came to visit Mark and I'm just going to go and wash the dishes. Said no person, said me, never, ever, never wash the dishes in my life. Don't know what that looks like. But if an angel is coming to visit my house, I'm going to make sure that I'm in the room. Sarah had excluded herself from the room. She had excluded herself from the promise, and the reasons that she gave was that I'm too old and I'm infertile. I've got a double whammy. I'm double barren. Not only am I barren, but I'm double barren. Ever done that? My dad's big. My dad's bigger than yours. This is my promise. This is my problem. Like, double barren. So not only is it impossible, but it's really impossible. And so she excluded herself from the room. And I just thought, what reasons have you and I given to exclude ourselves from the room? Take ourselves out of the room? Have we used the reason I'm too old? I'm too young. I have too little experience. I have too much experience. I have no use. I haven't accomplished anything. I have too many issues. Oh, if you knew my past, it's better that I exclude myself from the room. And I want to encourage you this morning. As I said to you at the beginning, God gave us access to the room. And so you and I can step into the room. A couple of months ago, I was attempting to do a little bit of a run in Eagle Canyon, and I was listening to a message, and they just asked us just to pause and go, almost like, what reason have you given to take yourself out of the game? And I really believe it was a Holy Spirit moment, because it was far too clever for me to come up with it. And God just said to me, you've always put yourself in second place. You've always felt second best. And I was like, nah, never. And then he started dropping in primary school. You weren't the number one student, you were number two. High school, you weren't number one, you were number two. And then he even said, don't you find it funny how you go to an anti-aging specialist for a health eating plan, and your husband says, let's do it together, and he benefits more from it than you do? Second place. And he said, that's a lie. You've excluded yourself from the room. It's a lie. And I really have made that moment. It's like, you know what? No more. I will not exclude myself from the room that God has given us access to. And so verse 12 says that Sarah laughed to herself. She may have excluded herself from the room, but she could still hear what was happening. Love it. And she hears them say, well, here's your promise. And she laughs at them. And she's basically laughing at the promise of God. And when we exclude ourselves from the room, we run the risk of laughing at the promise. And when we laugh at the promise, our hearts become hard. Our hearts can become toxic. We can become critical in our spirit, critical in the way we speak. And we run the risk of having a very distorted picture of what's actually happening in the room. I want to encourage you. Don't exclude yourself from the room, and don't laugh at the promise of God. And you know, it's very easy. The Bible is filled with God's promises. And I want to put one up on the screen right now, and it's Romans 8, verse 28. Here's a promise. And we know that God causes everything to work for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes for them. That's a promise. Just pause for a moment and just evaluate how you've responded to that promise. Loved those who love God. Yeah, that's meant for other people, not for me. Those who are called. That's meant for other people, not for me. And it's very easy for us to take a promise of God and go, that's not for me. It's for everybody else, but it's not for me. And in the kindest way, when we do that, what we're doing is that we're laughing at the promise and we're excluding ourselves from the room that we were never meant to be excluded from. Another classic one is John 10, verse 10. I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. It's a promise. How do you respond to that promise? In verse 15, but Sarah denied it. She was called out, that she was laughing. God called her out, and Sarah denied it, for she was afraid. Sarah wasn't afraid of the promise. She was afraid of the fact that she had just been called out. God called her out. God confronted her hard heart, confronted her laughing at a promise, and confronted her critical spirit. So what room have you excluded yourself from? And can I encourage you, don't exclude yourself from that room. Maybe this morning you haven't excluded yourself from a room, but you need the courage to stay in the room. Room number 2, we see this in Luke 10, verse 38 to 42, and it says this, now they were on their way. Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teachings. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Verse 38, we see Martha invited Jesus into her house. She owned the house. She was probably a widower. And it was her house. And actually, at this particular time, it would have been very dangerous for her to say, Jesus, come into my room, come into my house. Because culture had said, no, Jesus is not the person that you should be inviting to your house, not the person you should be inviting into your room. But Jesus was saying, and Martha was saying, yes. And so sometimes we've got to have the courage to stay in the room, even when culture says to us, no. What does Jesus say? And so we have Martha who welcomes Jesus into her house, and then we have Mary. And I think, listen, let's be honest. I think sometimes we give Martha a very bad rap, and we give her a very tough time, but she took a risk to bring Jesus into her home. And in verse 39, Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teachings, Mary was not allowed to sit and listen. She wasn't allowed to sit at the rabbi's feet. That was for the men. But she chose to position herself up close and personal and was listening intently to Jesus. So again, when culture had said, no, that's not what you do, Jesus said, yes, it's exactly what you do. You put yourself in the room and you stay in the room. Martha shouldn't have welcomed Jesus in. Mary shouldn't have sat at Jesus' feet, but they both had the courage to stay in the room. It's difficult to stay in the room when culture says you don't belong in the room. It's difficult to stay in the room when we have an enemy that lies to us to make sure that we don't stay in the room. This scripture has really hit me hard the last couple of months, John 8, verse 44 to 45, and it's talking about the devil, and it says, he was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth. If you guys wouldn't mind putting it up, I'm sure it's there. Because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I, God, tell you the truth, you do not believe me. I know we have this cute little saying that says the devil is a liar. I don't think it's cute. It's serious. He is a liar. He does not know how to tell the truth. It says that it's out of his own character. His very character is that he lies. Fathers in the room, I don't know how you introduce yourselves, but maybe you might say, hi, I'm Mark. I'm the father of Ethan and Shiloh. The devil introduces himself. He goes, hi, I'm the father of lies. What an introduction. He does not know how to do anything else. And he makes it personal. He doesn't just say, that's bad. He says, you're bad. And then it says it, which really scares me, is that even when God tells us the truth, we don't believe him. We are so good at believing the lies that we don't know how to believe when God's truth comes, when his promises come. And so we have lies that tell us, you shouldn't be here. You don't belong here. You're alone. No one gets you. You're of no use. You're past your sell-by date. You're too old. You're too young. And it's a lie. The devil, because he can't do anything else, he can't tell you the truth. He can only lie. And why would you lie? Because you don't want them to believe the truth. So what's the truth? You do belong. You do have a purpose. You do have a calling. You are understood. You do have value. You belong in the room. I really want to encourage you. The enemy makes the lie personal, but Jesus makes the truth personal. You are my people, and I am your God. I was trying to rack through my brain last night, the promises of God. There are so many. You're the head, not the tail. Neither height, nor depth, nor breadth can separate you from the love of God. So many. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, and he'll direct your paths. What was meant for your harm, he will turn for your good. Can we believe those more than the lies? Call it out. Call the lie out. I've gotten quite good at this. Just in terms of pastoral care and chatting with people, and they'll say something and I'll go, that's a lie. That's a lie. I'm not enough. That's a lie. Call it out. And if you have to do it out loud, do it. But call it out and stop the lie right then and there. There's another little bit of a side note that I just want to take here, is that staying in the room, or having the courage to stay in the room, can also mean staying in community. Devastated to hear some stats last week that this is the loneliest generation to ever exist. The loneliest. I don't think COVID helped in any way. And we've become so driven to be autonomous, to be independent. COVID has really helped to accelerate relationships without intimacy. We live online in a lot of ways. And it's the one-liner from a mental health specialist was saying, people are intentionally pursuing a life that destroys their mental health and robs them of real joy and lasting fulfillment, because they're not in community. And so I want to encourage you, staying in the room might for you mean staying in community. Don't let this be the narrative of this generation, that we are the loneliest generation. Maybe you haven't excluded yourself from the room, and maybe it's not about the courage of staying in the room. Maybe it's the courage to step into a room. And many of you may know the story of Esther, and we have Esther, who is a queen. She's Jewish. We have her uncle Mordecai, and we have this man named Haman, whose plan is to remove the entire Jewish nation. And Mordecai comes to Esther and says, you need to step into the room. You need to go to the king and you need to tell him about this. And Esther's reply in verse 11 is, you don't understand. I can't just step into the room. Because if I step into the room and I haven't been asked to come into the room and the king doesn't raise his scepter, I am tickets. I am dead. There is no room for me to go to except for the grave. But then she says to Mordecai in Esther chapter 4, verse 15 to 17 and 5 to 1 and 3, she tells them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, nights or days. And I and my young woman will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king. I will go into the room. Though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. And I asked the worship team to come up, sorry. The courage to step into the room started with turning to God before turning to the king. It started with recognizing whose authority she was stepping into the room with. It wasn't about the king. And on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courts of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the gold scepter that was in his hand. And then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to half of your kingdom. When we recognize the authority, it gives us favor in the room, even though our enemies might be in the room. Haman was in the room. The very person that was wanting to take out her nation was in that throne room as well. And so even though it was probably a stressful place or a stressful room to step into, it wasn't comfortable, it was risky, it might even have been hostile. Because of the authority that she was going into, she could feel peace. Because of the authority that she was under. Don't exclude yourself from a room that God has placed you in. The authority didn't belong to the king in that room. It didn't belong to Haman. It didn't belong to anything. It didn't belong to the scepter. The authority in the room was God. Sometimes it's just recognizing that when you step into a room, what you're stepping into the room with. God's given you the authority, and you might be in a school environment, in a work environment, and maybe it is uncomfortable. Maybe it is hostile. Maybe there is an enemy there. But you're stepping in with the authority of God. So take courage and step into that room. I just want to close with a story, and like Nathan, I also asked permission if I could share this story. While I was in the UK, I met up with Lorene. There's a picture of all three of us. Lorene's at the back. Lorene has just joined the Liberty Legends category. She's just turned 60. Lorene started Liberty Legends in 2006. Her and 3 other volunteers wanted to get the legends together and just love on them. So they prepared food for 20 people because, again, we do food, right? We do food. And 2 people came. Wasn't even 2 people from Liberty. It was 2 people that had relocated from Durban and heard about Liberty and decided to come. And so 2006, Liberty Legends was started with 4 volunteers and 2 people. And now it is one of our fastest growing ministries at Liberty Church. So on the eve of her 60th birthday, she was reflecting. She got saved when she was 9. She said, I've experienced 50 years of God's faithfulness. And she said she found a picture. And unfortunately, she didn't get it to me in time. But she found a picture of her as a 6-year-old dressed in a ballet leotard, a tutu, and ballet shoes. And she says she clearly remembers being told by her dancing teacher the wrong date and the wrong venues for the concerts because they didn't want her to be in the concert. As a 6-year-old, she was excluded from the room. The eve of her 60th birthday, we had a ladies' night at Liberty Church UK where I spoke, and then we had a dance class. Never heard of this in my life. Evidently, it's a thing. But we had a Latin gospel dance class. Now, there is no evidence of this because no coordination from anyone in the room, except for the person doing the dance class. But we paused at the end of that, and we just marveled at how God brings things full circle. And going, you were excluded in the room as a 6-year-old. But can I remind you that 54 years later, God has never excluded you from a room. Even 54 years later, God was saying, you belong in the room. Let's dance. I won't tell you the wrong date, and I won't tell you the wrong venue. We're going to dance in the room tonight. I would love just in our closing moments just to respond. The worship team are going to come out and just sing. And you know, you're in a room this morning, and I really want to encourage you that maybe you've excluded yourself from the room. And the best way that I can ask you to respond to that is to put yourself in the room. And so as the worship team sings, if you feel like you've excluded yourself from the room and excluded yourself from a promise, I want to encourage you to say that you have not been excluded from the room. And I want you to physically do an act of coming to the front and positioning yourself in the room. Maybe you're battling to stay in the room this morning. Position yourself at the altar and saying, I'm staying in the room. No matter what culture says, no matter what people say, no matter what I'm hearing, I'm staying in the room. And maybe you need the courage to step into the room today and step into community today. And so I want to encourage you that this altar is open for you to come and step into the room this morning.